Hey, have you ever watched a video that annoyed you so much that makes you want to bomb a government agency? Well, I can confidently say that Big Citrus has come back to give me this feeling, since his new video on Marvel Rivals and Overwatch is flat out frustrating to watch. It's not for his obvious rage bait title and thumbnail, no. There's multiple layers to this. But before we get to the response part of this video, I need to remind everyone that this is a critique of how Big Citrus makes content, not his character. I'm pretty sure he's an okay guy off camera, so don't give him a hard time, and harassment is completely unacceptable. Got that? Good. So, what's the video about in the first place? Well, that leads us to my first problem with the video. It's very misleading and at some points contradictory. If we look at the thumbnail and title, you'd assume it's how Overwatch 2 is overtaking Marvel Rivals in player count or game quality, but actually it's a parody and commentary about X game telling Y game discourse. Alright then, the title and thumbnail are pretty clickbaity, but hey, sometimes that's what you need to get the proper crowd to listen to your message. Except I lied, because that's the first half of the video and the longer second half is just a response video to another guy that comes out of the blue. It has some connection to the first half and the overall theme of Big Citrus combating the Marvel Rivals killing Overwatch agenda, but it's still very disjointed from the rest of the video, not just in general content, but also the arguments made. In the first half, Big Citrus argues that Marvel Rivals would be a better game for people just wanting to play one or two characters and isn't as counter-heavy, only to later completely turn around in the second half to say this isn't actually the case.
Of them. The way I look at it, Marvel Rivals is more for someone who would one-trick Moira or Genji in Overwatch. Characters that are not meant to be picked in every scenario. And Marvel Rivals is really gay. Marvel Rivals is really great for someone who just wants to pick one or two or three heroes. I also think you can make the argument that yes, you can master one of the 9 classes in TF2 and never really have to counter swap, but I don't think this applies to Marvel Rivals. Nowadays, with how sweaty the game is and once everyone's learned what the strongest things in the game are, there's about like 6 or 7 heroes you could probably effectively one-trick, and the rest, if you're gonna one-trick them, you are not going to need to be pretty good, you are going to need to be exceptional at that hero to get to a high rank.
Like I said, just very confused. However, a few mixed signals are pretty tame compared to the rest of the content. How, you may ask? Because Big Citrus breaks the YouTube street code and resorts to cutting context to try to take down someone else's video. For some context, the video Big Citrus is responding to is a video by Lucid, where he provides his own take on why Marvel Rivals was overtaking Overwatch in terms of popularity. He also has responded to multiple of Big Citrus's videos on his video review podcast, Upon Further Review. This podcast is what initially got Big Citrus's attention on his channel, and eventually led to him stumbling upon his Marvel Rivals video, which Big Citrus views as mostly bad and tries to debunk it. However, in order to do this, Big Citrus constantly cuts context and argues in bad faith in order to try to make Lucid's video look bad. The first example of this is, well, the very first counter-argument Big Citrus poses.
I'd put hundreds of total hours into Overwatch over the past few years.
But wait a second, I thought you said your playtime on a game doesn't matter.
Here we see Big Citrus trying to make Lucid look like a hypocrite since he mentions his hours on Overwatch despite him making a video on how your hour count doesn't matter. However, that is only half the context. The reason Lucid mentions his hour count is because he previously wrote off Marvel Rivals with 4 point due to his bias towards Overwatch, since he had invested so much time into it.
Speaking from my own experience, I initially wrote off Rivals in the same way. I'd put hundreds of total hours into Overwatch over the past few years, and I couldn't see myself enjoying another game in the same genre, especially when I expected it to be slop, attempting to mimic a gameplay style done much better elsewhere.
Additionally, the video that Big Citrus brings up doesn't weaken this point, but rather reinforces it, as one of Lucid's arguments is how higher hour counts can lead to more bias towards a game, which was the exact point in the Marvel Rivals video.
In fact, I'd actually argue that players with a massive playtime are more likely to have an incredibly biased perspective on a game's design. This is for 3 separate reasons. Number 1, players with a high playtime probably have a large emotional commitment to the game, meaning they're much more likely to defend the game rather than agree with someone tearing it down. A player with a lower playtime is more likely to have an unbiased take on the game, and may identify problems that the older players have grown used to over time.
With this, Big Citrus makes a terrible start to his response, as it reveals he is willing to lie in order to make someone else look worse. This train of bad faith argumentation continues as he twists Luce's comments about how Blizzard will create annoying characters only for them to be watered down later as a comment about balancing rather than character design. He even cuts the part beforehand where Luce makes a distinction between balancing issues and design issues, so Luce's aren't as easy to be contorted.
Blizzard will design characters around really cool ideas, but then forego developing the idea in favor of releasing them immediately and slowly tuning them into a more palatable state as patches get released.
This is Blizzard's constant philosophy when it comes to designing new characters for Overwatch. Release now, and patch later.
Release now and patch later, you say. Oh no. This is why I waited to make a video on this topic, because I had a very good feeling about where Marvel Rivals was going to go in terms of balancing. But then you have characters like Invisible Woman and Emma Frost, who are the characters who are trying to draw people into the game the most, and their abilities do feel a bit too strong and unfun to play against, and do feel like they had a design of, well, Invisible Woman has to do stuff that's invisible, and then Emma Frost has to have mind control shit, and neither of these things are fun to play against in-game at all. And I'm not saying Overwatch doesn't do this, and Mauga definitely is the worst character that's ever been added to Overwatch, don't at me, but I think actually we have seen with Mauga that once they've added perks and kind of just made him dog shit, he's more of a pick that's viable only in certain comps or at lower ranks, and honestly, he is not the powerhouse he used to be at all anymore. I'd argue he's probably the worst tank in the game besides Doomfist right now.
Overwatch faced a large amount of criticism for the way Blizzard designs their characters, with the quality of each hero being wildly inconsistent when it comes to their set of abilities and skills. This inconsistency results in players finding various characters incredibly unfun to play as, or worse, to play against. For instance, when Mauga was released, players absolutely despised his design. He had such an absurdly large health pool that battles often devolved into one team attempting to take down the Mauga, while the other team constantly pocketed them and kept them alive. One might say that this was a balancing issue, not an issue with Mauga's core design, but therein lies the problem. Blizzard will design characters around really cool ideas, but then forego developing the idea in favor of releasing them immediately and slowly tuning them into a more palatable state as patches get released. This is Blizzard's constant philosophy when it comes to designing new characters for Overwatch. Release now, and patch later.
To further drive this point home, Big Citrus continues this train of dodging the point to try to make Lucid look worse by changing the context behind his Ramatra clip to make it look like another balancing, when the criticism was about Ramatra's ultimate being able to last forever on launch, which was later reworked after the player base universally found it annoying.
Also, just him putting stuff like this in the video is just weird.
It is. Oh shit. 2 hours later.
Okay, like, I get his point. He's trying to say that, like, fights in Overwatch sometimes feel like ultimates are just going on forever and literally no one dies, but Marvel Rivals is way worse with the infinite ult no one dying problem.
I want to stress that this philosophy isn't just a problem for the competitive players who take Overwatch super seriously. It affects everybody.
Here it is. Oh shit.
2 hours later.
So far, Big Citrus is 3 for 3 on cutting context, but how about another one for the road? Big Citrus attacks the notion of Marvel Rivals being playtested extensively for release by mentioning the poor balance of Luna Snow's Ultimate and Hawkeye on release.
The extensive playtesting the Rivals devs did during the beta allowed them to release a set of characters that all have distinct strengths and weaknesses, with none of them being unfun to learn and fight against.
Extensive playtesting? You're telling me that Luna's Snow ult was okay and that Hawkeye was tested? No, we changed this after the beta. We tested it for the live game. It's gonna be okay, guys.
This may seem like an actual good point for Big Citrus at first. However, there are 2 things that aren't mentioned. One is that Lucid is still talking about general character design rather than balance and tuning, and 2, Hawkeye can be considered a blind spot due to not actually being tested in the betas, but rather released in Season 0. This is also the case for other heroes that were excluded from the betas, like Cloak and Dagger, Iron Fist, and Jeff the Landshark, which were all controversial in some way. It was so close to being a good point. However, instead of going the blind spot approach, Big Citrus just takes these exceptions to try to dismiss Lucid's point wholesale. At this point, it's blatant that Big Citrus is not responding to Lucid in good faith, but we're still not done here yet. A bit later in the video, Big Citrus takes a shot at Lucid, claiming that Super Smash Bros. And Team Fortress 2 allowing more freedom in picking characters by pointing out Super Smash Bros. Also has matchups which characters are tiered on.
In Rivals, the weaknesses of characters are often able to be exploited by everyone, not just specific characters. This means, much like games like Super Smash Bros. Or TF2, anyone can play pretty much any character and still have a significant impact on the game.
I'm just shocked because this implies this isn't the case in Overwatch, but it is the case in a game like Super Smash Bros. Where characters are literally tier listed off of how strong they are against the strongest characters in the game and countering them. And in Team Fortress 2, where I don't give a fuck what you want to say, a good soldier and medic combo is basically unbeatable.
When once again, context is cut when Lucid says that matchups aren't inherently bad, but Overwatch leans into them too much, as shown in this clip he didn't show.
Now, matchups are a natural part of creating a game with multiple characters, so I'm not saying that the mere existence of counterpicking is the problem. However, the implementation of it is so absolute that it kind of flies in the face of actually learning a single character for a prolonged period of time.
And objectively speaking, matchups are far less impactful in Super Smash Bros. Than in Overwatch, as it's a lot easier to offset a matchup discrepancy with sheer skill than in Overwatch, hence why off-meta picks are far more common in high-level gameplay. However, we're still not at the worst case of bad faith argumentation, as Big Citrus goes one step forward with cutting context by creating new context.
You see, the thing about competitively driven video games is that they will almost always develop a reputation for being frustrating and overly punishing to play. This is because there are always going to be more people who play a game casually than competitively. But just because it's hard doesn't mean it's impossible. Marvel Rivals is a game that strikes this balance pretty well, but ironically it does so by not being balanced at all.
I don't know, seems like some of that frustration's starting to set in. I'm not sure how people didn't see that Marvel Rivals was instantly going to turn into Overwatch, especially for the people who legitimately thought that Marvel Rivals actually killed Overwatch. You just know that means that all the Overwatch players are going to go to Marvel Rivals then. Gamers are just inherently sweaty and are going to sweat their ass, dick, and balls off even in quick play, so.
Looks like a pretty normal response at first. Lucid said something that aged poorly, and Big Citrus capitalized for once, scoring a proper point. If it wasn't for the fact that Big Citrus had to splice the clip in order to make it seem like Lucid was making a completely different argument. Here's the original clip from the video.
Overwatch was a game designed from the ground up to be an esport, meant to be played competitively first and foremost. This made the game a massive commercial success, largely because it released at the same time as the late 2010s esports craze was just getting started. However, in the long run, it made Overwatch an agonizing game to play for most people. You see, the thing about competitively driven video games is that they will almost always develop a reputation for being frustrating and overly punishing to play. This is because there are always going to be more people who play a game casually than competitively. As such, when someone gets into Overwatch for the first time, casually, they're bound to come away feeling frustrated when they get stomped into oblivion by the existing player base who take the game way too seriously. When Blizzard chose to design Overwatch for competitive players, they indirectly chose to make the game worse for everyone else. While this was fine for the short-term success of Overwatch, it didn't really help in the long run. It's understandable, of course. Designing a game to be both fun casually and competitively is certainly no easy task. Many of the best games ever made were intentionally designed to be fun casually first and foremost, while having enough mechanical depth to also be enjoyed competitively as well. But just because it's hard, doesn't mean it's impossible. Marvel Rivals is a game that strikes this balance pretty well, but ironically it does so by not being balanced at all.
Yep, this is a completely different argument from what Big Citrus is responding to. It's hard to catch this splice as a casual viewer because Big Citrus will just splice any stops between sentences, which is a horrendous editing choice, by the way. Why would you spend more time to make your videos sound worse? But it's clear as day if you watched the original video before this response. Lucid was initially discussing how Overwatch's competitive focus made the game worse for the majority of the player base compared to Marvel Rivals taking the opposite approach, with Overwatch generally seen as frustrating merely made as an offhand remark. But once again, Citrus takes this one statement, cuts it out of its context, and tries to spin it as a whole argument. This continues with this response.
I don't think it's a hot take to say that Rivals is a very unbalanced game.
I'm sorry, he deflected an ult with his shield that the Iron Man shot into the entire enemy team from like 80 meters away, giving them plenty of time to react. I'm not sure what was unbalanced about that.
Again, he's setting up this gag clip as the whole reason on why Lucid believes Marvel Rivals is imbalanced. However, this is meant to be a more comedic clip before he goes into detail. Does Big Citrus ever acknowledge this? Of course not. Leaving out integral parts of the video is par for the course by now, and we're still not done yet. Somehow. Here's Lucid criticizing the lack of expression that Overwatch's characters have, which Citrus reflects by saying that Marvel Rivals has a similar lack of expression.
But while Pixar's characters are often super expressive and cartoonish, Overwatch's characters are usually sterile, expressing just one or two emotions in all of their animations.
Oh yeah, no mate, the character expressions in Marvel Rivals are just, I'm getting a lot from this.
Again, a valid point on its own, but there's a ton of context missing. First of all, Lucid was bringing up Pixar in the first place due to how competitive their styles looked with the big eyes and smooth skin, with Pixar's charm coming from the aforementioned expressive characters. Here's the full clip for context.
Looking broadly at Overwatch's art style, it's clearly meant to mimic that of Pixar's 3D style, with the big eyes and smooth skin. But while Pixar's characters are often super expressive and cartoonish, Overwatch's characters are usually sterile, expressing just one or two emotions in all of their animations.
Second of all, Lucid had already argued for Marvel Rivals' stylistic appeal in a previous section that again is swept under the rug. It also has some criticisms against Marvel Rivals too, kind of breaking Citrus's agenda that he's blindly praising the game to take down Overwatch. I now would like to present an excerpt from it.
To the small bits of onomatopoeia text thrown around, to the comic book style stories attached to each and every map, this game does an excellent job at contextualizing every aspect of its gameplay within the comic book world. Even the dialogue between characters is often referencing some specific piece of lore within Marvel's comic universe, giving the player a serious impression of the history all of these characters share with one another. That said, I would like to throw a slight bit of criticism in here, which is that the aforementioned quips characters make can often be incredibly on the nose, lacking any real substance and coming off more as annoying than anything else.
Okay, I think I've driven the point fully home with taking things out of context. To put it frankly, this amount of context cutting is disgusting and is good reason to never trust one of his videos. Anyways, my work is still not done because there's other problems other than the context cutting. Thankfully are tame compared to what I just covered, so this section is going to be comprised of more minor forms of misinformation or misdirection. To start this section off, we have Big Citrus responding to a potential criticism of him being hypocritical by bashing people who overuse X game is dying when he used to make videos doing the same thing. Or rather, he brings up the criticism and then he brings up a non sequitur.
And I know someone in the comments is going to compare me to Anthony Fantano because I used to make videos that were kind of like this. What I've learned is as a YouTuber, if you don't have an opinion that matches what the other big content creators, streamers, and YouTubers are saying, your video isn't going to get as many views, unfortunately, so that's why a lot of people just resort to having the safest opinion possible.
This play is particularly strange, since not only does he pivot to a completely unrelated subject, but he actually has a solid response to it later, saying he'll try not to contribute to this discourse later. Too bad he looks like a complete hypocrite later by making a video titled Dead Game Discourse again, but hey, nobody's perfect.
I mainly just wanted to use this video that I think aged poorly and just was kind of rushed to prove some points about what I really don't like about modern gaming discourse, and I'm going to try and stop adding to it myself.
Next thing on the chopping block are two criticisms about Marvel Rivals that feel tone deaf or flat out wrong. Firstly, he criticizes ability diversity by saying 50% of the abilities are the same, with text on the screen that 70% of the abilities are either movement abilities with damage or regenerating health with damage.
50% of the characters have identical abilities, basically.
Alright, I may sound harsh for saying this, but this statement is completely idiotic. Most of these identical abilities have specific nuances that make them interesting. The percentage in question also feels completely overblown with no evidence to back it up, and I just hate this reductive thinking. That's like saying every Monster Hunter weapon plays the same because 70% of the moves are slashes or slams, when anyone who has played any of the games can tell you this is completely untrue. Heck, if you want to stretch it, this criticism that Citrus makes can be applied to Overwatch, but nobody does that. Why? Because that's stupid. The second dumb criticism he makes is about the best characters in Marvel Rivals having one-shot ultimates, infinite healings, or stuns.
And the strongest characters in the game are the ones that have insta-kill ultimates or infinite healing ultimates or stun abilities, and it creates a very unsatisfying and unrewarding gameplay loop.
This would hold water if he wasn't constantly praising Overwatch, a game notorious for, you guessed it, one-shots, get out of jail free abilities, and stuns. In fact, I feel Marvel Rivals is better in this because there's a lot less stuns. But I don't have the math to back this up, so this is merely a hunch. One thing I definitely can fight back on is another supposed debunk in the second half of the video, where Big Citrus claims that Lucid's list of characters that were relatively unchanged is inaccurate, only to bring a more questionable list.
And even I've struggled to keep up with how often different characters are changed or reworked.
I'm kind of genuinely shocked at how false this was. Here is an actual list of every character that has not been significantly changed since 2021.
Some of the picks are fine, like Hanzo and Tracer. Some were questionable with Diva and Sigma, with both undergoing massive tuning changes due to the turbulent state of tanks, and others are flat out wrong, like Mei, Farah, Symmetra, and 2 supports in Brigade and Mercy, which nullifies a statement of every support except for Zenyatta, since Lucid has already listed every other support released before 2021. Heck, I'd make a case for Moira making the list due to enfeebling or becoming an ability only to be cut in the same Overwatch 2 beta it was released in, but that's a stretch. Main point is, while Lucid's list arguably left out some other characters that weren't majorly changed, Big Citrus in the list characters that were straight up reworked have dunked on this point. One final thing I want to cover is definitely a nitpick, but something still worth mentioning, as Big Citrus has a more minor, 2-word criticism of Marvel Rivals.
Gooner bait.
While I agree that Marvel Rivals is leaning a bit too much into fan service right now, it's important to note that the person making this criticism has put cropped porn in the video, and has, let's say, distasteful thumbnail design. It would be like if 6ix9ine called people rats in his music, or if EDP called someone out for being a predator. Gang update, what do you mean both of those guys actually did that? But speaking of calling other people rats, that leads us into my final prompted video. Big Citrus is moving like one. Back to the response section of the video, Big Citrus claims multiple times that he has no bad blood with Lucid and just wants to criticize a video that he feels aged poorly.
I want to make it very clear, please do not go send hate to Lucid or any of the people who were involved in this podcast. I am not singling them out for this. It just so happens that I thought this would be a good video to dissect for the purpose of this video. I uploaded my videos to the internet that they ended up criticizing. It's completely fair use of them to do that. I mostly talked it out with them in their Discord afterwards. But also, he uploaded this video to the internet. So, it's also okay for me to make this video criticizing his video that I think is mostly bad, and I hope it gives a good insight into how the average Marvel Rivals and TF2 fan thinks.
However, I have multiple reasons to believe that there is still some sort of grudge boiling beneath the surface that serves as a motivation for this response. My first piece of evidence to this theory is the second sentence, where he then talks about how he has the right to criticize Lucid's video because he feels it's mostly bad and it's an example of the mindset of TF2 or Marvel Rivals players. Ignoring the fact his response only covers a fraction of Lucid's video, unlike how he claims the video is mostly bad, he also puts on text reading, introducing the delusion of a TF2 fan in the modern age. With the previous comment, this implies that Lucid is delusional, essentially sneak dissing him. You can argue this isn't an insult because he never directly calls Lucid delusional, but the implication is still there. In fact, this narrative just doesn't work in the first place because 1. Lucid was initially biased against Marvel Rivals as stated in the start of his video, and 2. Lucid has another video criticizing the entire TF2 vs Overwatch debate as a concept, and 3. Multiple instances in the Marvel Rivals video where he depicts Overwatch as overshadowing TF2, so he clearly does not represent this movement Big Citrus is describing. However, this train of sneak dissing and general misrepresentation of Lucid's character doesn't stop here. In fact, you already saw the second example. In the mail was sent where Big Citrus talks about how the beef was in the past and there was nothing wrong with your criticism, he puts up a screenshot of the podcast where Lucid and his group criticized him, specifically a bingo card predicting certain talking points or aspects of the video. Citrus puts some text saying, "They did make a bingo card based on the obvious criticism of TF2 I was going to make," which implies factually incorrect information is just a common point of TF2 critics, but okay. Which the only reason I can see would be mentioned is that Big Citrus is trying to paint his critics as unreasonable. However, his theory would not just hold up with this, but there's another example that proves it. Roll the clip, and pause. A direct case of Big Citrus doing this again with the purpose of making the UFR group look overly harsh. Granted, I did feel the Steam account search was a little unwarranted, but 1. In the same podcast, Lucid and ZestDJs had differing opinions on playtime mattering, so it's unfair to lump them together. And 2, fact-checking this obsessively doesn't seem so crazy to me now I've seen how much Big Citrus is willing to lie. Again, it's more the same, I have no problem with these people who criticize me, but also you're overly obsessed with TF2 meat, whereas I'll scream at you for 10 hours if you don't like the game. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Our next example of this two-faced behavior is actually back at the start of the response section, where he talks about how Lucid criticized him in place of clips from the podcast where he does so.
I'm gonna kidnap him, I'm gonna lock him in a fucking cellar, I'm gonna Chinese war torture him until, like, I don't know, fucking goes insane.
I am amazed. What a fucking idiot.
Skibidi Toilet took more effort than this.
This is, again, put in to make the people on a Pond Fervor review look as unreasonable as possible. Even though the torture part is obviously done for comedic purposes only, and the other two statements that are put in are pretty tame. Matter of fact, there's just no proper reason to include the first clip as this is meant to be a response to Lucid. Space Guy and Zesty have nothing to do with the video that Lucid made, and once again, expose how blatant Big Citrus' agenda is. I'd say that's enough evidence to make sure my theory has some oxygen, but how about 2 more instances for the road? Back to the response section, Lucid expresses his heaviest stays for Overwatch's overall art direction, which Citrus doesn't take it well.
And speaking honestly, I think Overwatch has one of the most bland and forgettable art styles
I've ever seen. There is nothing special or extraordinary about the way Overwatch looks. It's as if Blizzard sat down in a laboratory and surgically decided the exact combination of influences necessary to appeal to the lowest common denominator of person. It's genuinely awful.
Dog, I don't think it was that serious. Oh my god, what the fuck? Like, the mask starts to slip a little bit and the vitriol comes out. Like, it's not that deep, bruh.
Granted, Lucid's words towards Overwatch are indeed harsh, but Big Citrus tries to make it out to be incredibly unreasonable and vitriolic. But at the end of the day, it's mainly Lucid saying his negative thoughts on Overwatch's art style, with Citrus providing no arguments on why Lucid is wrong for this take. Not to mention, Big Citrus loses any right to chastise Lucid for his overwhelmingly negative opinions on Overwatch's art style, when he states equally biting criticism of the art direction of Marvel Rivals.
And also, I don't think this game puts any effort into its art or world building. It's just copycatting so many other games' art styles, blending it into one.
In fact, the clip is edited more, and not just in its typical way of speeding up clips and removing any pauses between sentences. To demonstrate this, I'll show the original clip, and then the Big Citrus cut, back to back.
And speaking honestly, I think Overwatch has one of the most bland and forgettable art styles I've ever seen. There is nothing special or extraordinary about the way Overwatch looks. It's as if Blizzard sat down in a laboratory and surgically decided the exact combination of influences necessary to appeal to the lowest common denominator of person. It's genuinely awful.
And speaking honestly, I think Overwatch has one of the most bland and forgettable art styles
I've ever seen. There is nothing special or extraordinary about the way Overwatch looks. It's as if Blizzard sat down in a laboratory and surgically decided the exact combination of influences necessary to appeal to the lowest common denominator of person. It's genuinely awful.
Besides the random memes just jammed in, the main differences between the two cuts are that the Citrus cut is trying to make Lucid's comments harsher and more dramatic. The most obvious one being the music. While the original video has a more relaxed and less distracting background music, the Big Citrus cut has One Winged Angel, which by the way really gets some originality, to make it sound more dramatic than it actually is. Additionally, more emphasis is Lucid calling Overwatch's art style bad, once again to make it sound more vitriolic. Yet another case of Big Citrus trying to make Lucid look more rabid, which just makes his no hard feelings comments from earlier seem all the hollower. Finally, I'd like to present one more piece of evidence that this response was not rooted in genuine criticism and intellectual integrity. Here's a clip from Lucid's video near the end.
Some people have also shown worry regarding the game's future, as the developers could potentially put so much content in the game that it becomes bloated beyond enjoyment. However, I'm much more interested in appreciating what the game is now, rather than dreading the monstrosity it could become in the future.
Besides a small audio hiccup near the end, these two sentences serve as a disclaimer that most of the points in this video are meant to discuss the game and its current state. and the video could age poorly. Essentially some future-proofing, since discussing a live service game in totality is incredibly difficult due to the fact that developers could change everything next season. This goes against Big Citrus' stated motivation in the video, as if it's meant to call out Lucid for making a video that aged poorly, when he already knew that.
And if anyone in the Bald Knuck podcast or Lucid is watching this, I mainly just wanted to use this video that I think aged poorly and just was kind of rushed to prove some points about what I really don't like about modern gaming discourse, and I'm going to try and stop adding to it myself.
What I'm trying to get at is the entire premise for the second half of the video is completely disingenuous, merely made to get back at a person who slighted him rather than an honest battle of ideas. That's the true worst part of the video, the fact it's not genuine. Quite frankly, it's just appalling. Big Citrus, if by some miracle you're watching us, I have one thing to say. Do not do this ever again. Those 40,000 views aren't worth the integrity hit. As for everyone else, I'd like to thank you for getting this far. I think it's time to start wrapping things up, as there's not much left for me to cover that doesn't boil down to, I disagree with that opinion personally. To summarize, the main problems with Big Citrus' video is the generally confused nature of the video in both topics and arguments, the constant cutting of context from Lucid's video, and the two-faced behavior in the second half. Integrity matters, and while making yourself look good by lying may result in positive reception in the short term, in the end, some of way too much free time will expose the truth. But who knows, this video might just flop and history will just repeat itself. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.